I think it's really a case of people who think they lost the last battle, want to win what they view as a new battle. And so they're applying the techniques that they wish they had done with the last battle. And that last battle is social media. And they feel like that got away from them and they've been unable to come up with any kind of big regulatory bills on content moderation and privacy. Now they're faced with a new technology.
Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government and the future. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do.
Well, we have a very special guest. I'm kind of a little bit of a fanboy, so I just realized that up front. James Pethokoukis, who's a scholar at American Enterprise Institute here in DC. He's also the author of an amazing Substack you should read called Faster, Please, and the author of a book, I guess it was last year, The Conservative Futurists. James, welcome to the podcast. It's awesome to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So let's start. You've done some stuff recently, some interviews on your podcast, which everyone should subscribe to, on the general role that AI might play in changing sort of the innovation game and in the United States or the world in general. So just talk a little bit about how you see it in your upwing philosophy. What role does AI play potentially?
I hope it's what I've been waiting for approximately my entire life, which is a technology which can greatly accelerate the development of other technologies, what economists like to call a general purpose technology. There's a lot of talk about what jobs it can replace and how it can do what you're doing. And the history of technology is that a machine has been created which can do something humans could do, but then humans figure out other things to do. And so that's like part of the story. But I think the real exciting part is AI as a super research assistant, and whether that's healthcare or energy or creating new materials, help our scientists be just wildly more efficient and create fantastic new products, help us live longer and make us all richer and that sort of thing. So that's sort of like what we hope. We hope that what we're seeing with AI, machine learning, and very specifically the generative AI, large language models that are able to sort of predict the next word or next concept. That's sort of the dream. That's what the bulls and the people who are very techno-optimists are hoping. That is what we have here. I don't expect we'll know if like the most optimistic predictions will come true in the next 6 months. I don't know if we'll know for sure in the next 12 months or 2 years, but I'm hoping by decade's end that we fully understand that we've gone through and continue to go through something pretty phenomenal.
Because you wrote in your book, The Conservative Futurists, and I think, it's something Tyler Cowen has called the Great Stagnation. It feels, from your perspective, is it the lack of a great general purpose technology that's caused I think you say 50 years of downwing kind of philosophy?
I think to the extent there's like an economic consensus as to why sort of the big economic and technology dreams of the immediate post-war decades did not come to fruition in a way people expected. Well, I think, which is not to say that we're no better off than we were 50 years ago. I don't think that's the case, but given where we are and where expectations were, and also that optimism we saw in the mid to late 90s, that finally we had figured it out and it was going to be off to the races, rapid growth forever, didn't happen. I think the consensus is that the great general purpose technologies of the Industrial Revolution, the late part of the Industrial Revolution, electrification, internal combustion engine, modern chemicals industry, that we were unable to find something with as much economic oomph as those advancements. And the IT revolution, computers and then the internet, super significant. And I think we're still seeing the full impact, obviously has been unable to sort of raise growth the way we had hoped. But what we're seeing with AI is part of that. So that revolution sort of isn't over. And again, it's my hope that what we're seeing now will be a significant step up in the impact of information technology and the application of intelligence in all aspects of life, and better late than never.
So I heard two things there. In the one way, it sounds like you could see AI as the capstone, maybe a capstone or the next step on a general information technology trend. So it's created some productivity, but it's really taken potentially AI as the step that actually gets you that electrification type thing where maybe there were multiple components of electrification that came before that didn't really deliver the full benefit until you had the whole package, right? So maybe AI is that capstone of the package that makes the internet revolution come to fruition. Is that sort of the way you would look at it potentially?
I mean, sort of the history of big innovations is it takes a while for people to sort of figure out how to best use them. I mean, there's a lot of stasis and people are used to doing things a certain way and people have to sort of be re-educated and companies have to figure things out. And that can take a long time. So I think that's sort of always part of it. And I would expect that to some degree to be the case with AI. But also, there's the fact that this is a fast evolving technology. And that's something I think people who want to regulate it have to contend with is that as you're having these debates, the debates are often sort of where the technology was 6 months ago or a year ago, which may not sound like very long ago, but if there's brand new models being churned out over the next 18 months, all of a sudden this debate looks sort of silly because the size of these models and the amount of compute it takes to sort of train them and run them, that has all completely changed. So in a way, this is kind of like what we've seen before, but in a way it might not be because it could happen a lot faster, affect more aspects of the economy. And if we are able to get, and I don't think this is necessary to have a big impact on the economy, if we are able to get something which can reasonably be called human level artificial intelligence, then I think we're sort of in off the grid. And I think all the predictions are sort of silly because you could really see just, I think, really huge advancements.
And this is sort of super intelligence. You interviewed Nick Bostrom recently. He wrote a book called that. And Leopold Aschenbrenner just wrote about that, I think, where you get AI researchers who basically can act as human researchers, right? And then you can make infinite numbers or you can scale them much faster than humans, right? So you start getting exponential returns.
So it's not only sort of sort of brute intelligence, but you also may have an intelligence that's able to find patterns and make connections in a way humans simply can't. We don't know. I mean, when you start talking about it, you're about 5 minutes in the conversation and you feel like you're really into sort of deep science fiction at that point because you start talking about the economy, growing at 30% a year. And all of a sudden we figured out cures to cancer and, nuclear fusion devices that can fit in our wallet. It starts to get a little crazy again. But I think you can be optimistic about the impact without going that far. I mean, just figure out sort of where we are right now, and companies are slowly figure out how to use these large language models as they are now. Like that's going to take a while, and hopefully there'll be a lot of productivity gains. If there was no further progress, I think we could get a lot of productivity gains, and I would certainly expect there to be more progress.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing when you were talking a little bit about the meager or the less than we hope for productivity coming from sort of the personal computer or internet revolution, I don't know if you've seen this website called WTF, What Happened in 1971, where essentially like every measure of productivity and increase, like in the United States started going down, right? And a lot of people blame that on regulatory state, right? NEPA, things like that. So do you think like one pushback could be like, yeah, the computer revolution and the internet and AI actually did add quite a lot of productivity, but at the same time, we were destroying productivity in these other sectors. So like, is that possible that that's happening at the same time? And does AI do anything about that? Or can it overwhelm it, I guess?
All these things are sort of multi-causal on both sides, which is always not a very satisfying answer because people want to either find some sort of magic bullet. So I think it's certainly the case, or at least I believe, that the cause of the great stagnation or the great downshift is multi-causal, and it's because we extracted all the productivity gains from these big inventions of the past, and we didn't follow up with any sort of equally oomphy kinds of inventions. I think, to me, there's no doubt that we began to regulate our economy as if we could continue to generate very fast growth and we could generate lots of tech progress, and not just, in cyberspace, which people didn't use back then, but in the real world, and we could build things and we could build nuclear reactors, that all that stuff could still kind of happen. Now, some people specifically hoped that the regulations would stop that from happening, but I don't think that was like the majority of the people. Majority of the people thought that we'd have all the good stuff that we thought we would have in the 60s, but just that we'd also have cleaner air. And people would have a bit more input into things being built in their areas, that we would just have that. But everything else, we'd still be able to have a space age and colonies on the moon and underwater cities. And again, and coast to coast nuclear reactors. Yeah, we'd still have all that stuff. But it turns out that it mattered the rules that we put in place, many of which were environmental rules. And when I first started writing the book, obviously, like the classic case is nuclear power, but it's still the case. It's still the case that whether to build a nuclear power plant or a high-speed rail or wind turbines, and it's hard to build these wind turbines, which are supposed to be a big part of the clean energy revolution. Not only is it hard to get them installed, it's hard to build the factories to build the wind turbines. And for the exact same rules that have been the case, many environmental rules at a state and local level that were the case 50 years ago. And finally, I think on both sides of the aisle, people are starting to figure that out, which is why I'm hopeful for progress. But there's no doubt that has, I think, not only offset some of the other pro-productivity forces, but made it hard to reach the full potential. My gosh, we're having this conversation about AI, and we talked about all the good things about AI for a week after ChatGPT, and then all of a sudden we were going to pause it, nationalize it, squash it, nuke it. So very quickly, I think those sort of old habits reemerged.
So you brought up a great point of kind of bringing these 2 points about the physical world and the cyberspace world together. And you do see something of a shift now that the environmental movement is, a lot of people who are favoring clean energy are being stymied in their ability to build recharging stations and wind farms and solar farms. So you're seeing some shift where some elements on the left are maybe hopefully could join with the right to do regulatory reform. And maybe you're seeing that with tech too, because they're seeing, as I think you pointed out, power is a huge limitation on our ability to use AI. Some of the projections are it would be 30 to 50% of our power supply would go to advanced AI, and we're just not able to build power plants at that point.
Actually, I just wrote an essay for my newsletter, and there had been this debate, what would be the big constraint on AI? Would it be the computing power, and would it be we would have enough GPUs, or would it be energy? And I think now the consensus is that it's going to be energy. That's applying enough energy and being able to get the energy, even if we build the power plants, to these data centers, is an enormous problem. And right now, the status quo is, if we don't change anything, the status quo is we will not be able to do that. So if any of this talk about what AI can do is at all encouraging or it's at all hopeful, it's not going to happen without the energy, which means there needs to be a change. The status quo will squash this. And again, I hope we can break through the filter here. And next year, once we get this election past us, there can be a lot of permitting reform to make it easier to build plants, to make it easier to build the electrical transmission network. Because without those things, then all we're going to get out of AI is being able to create some cool images on Midjourney or DALL-E or something. Not that those are insignificant.
So, yeah, I think if you saw a real alignment of traditional interests like fossil fuels and everybody who wants to build power plants and other things like that, aligned with tech, aligned with the green energy lobby, aligned in the environmental movement, aligned with, by the way, the national security establishment, who is going to see this as a security issue, our ability to power AI. That feels like a coalition that could actually get some reform done. So maybe AI ushers in, an alignment that really changes the standoff here.
When I try to figure out sort of what is the national mood, it's always very difficult to ask questions about what people think about technology or their optimism. But so I think a good shorthand is, what do people think about nuclear power? And if people think better about nuclear power, to me, that's a great way of sort of getting at how people think about technology, how they think about abundance, how they think about risk. And people seem to be becoming more and more in favor of nuclear power. because we went through this period of just general sort of shortages during the pandemic, and then we had prices go up, so we had expensive energy, and then particularly in Europe, they saw the problems with the war in Ukraine, where all of a sudden they regretted relying on Russian natural gas. So the idea of energy and abundance has been, I think, sort of a front of mind, and it certainly should be front of mind for our policymakers. And I think once you start thinking about that, well, then you start thinking about abundance in other areas. You start thinking about problem solving in other areas and how important energy is. And not only will the energy help AI, but it's like both ways, that AI can also help solve some huge energy problems, such as actually getting to like nuclear fusion. It can help solve key remaining scientific problems there as well. So I think it kind of helps put us in a mind frame of abundance and problem solving. Boy, and if that's how we're thinking and that's how our policy makers are thinking, we can make a lot of progress. We saw Operational Warp Speed during the pandemic, where when people start thinking about problem solving and maybe setting aside sort of, categories about what governments should do, what private sector should do, and about how they can work together, we can solve a lot of problems. And I hope that's kind of the phase we'll soon move into.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the regulatory side of AI. So we talked a little bit regulatory side on enabling it through energy. So you mentioned that we gloried in ChatGPT for all of, I'd say, 2.5 months. And then, even Elon and everybody's out saying, hey, we got to pause for 6 months. So that's kind of gone away. But the EU couldn't get out fast enough to try to crush the next wave of innovation, feels like. And now you're seeing these bills in California and other states. So what do you make of the regulatory state of AI at this point? And what do you think its prospects are?
Well, I think it's really a case of people who think they lost the last battle, want to win what they view as a new battle. And so they're applying the techniques that they wish they had done with the last battle. And that last battle is social media, and they feel like that got away from them, and they've been unable to come up with any kind of big regulatory bills on content moderation and privacy. And now they're faced with a new technology, and they don't want to hear about light regulation. They figure like, no, now we're going to jump on this. We're going to get informed, which is great. And we're going to come up right from the get-go. We're going to create a regulatory framework. And I think that's been the intention. The Senate under Chuck Schumer, they're bringing all these AI experts, economists, technologists to Capitol Hill. So they feel like they have they're not at such an extreme knowledge disadvantage. I think the lobbyists, when it comes to this issue, I think what has happened is the energy in that effort has dissipated. I think it's dissipated. One, I think as they learned more about the technology, and that the early fears about these Terminator scenarios where AI tries to kill us, so that dissipated. So then they are on sort of more mundane issues about, are these things biased, and how will it affect jobs? How will they affect elections? Which I think makes the whole thing seem somewhat less like we need to figure this out right now. Because if it's going to kill you, then maybe you do need to figure it out right now. But if it's just like sort of these very similar sounding problems, that perhaps the rush really isn't there. So I think that's absolutely part of it. I think that's one reason. Listen, I thought if there was going to be a regulatory wave about to crush this industry, I don't think AI-related stocks would be doing well, and all those kinds of companies have done well. And I think thirdly, I think it's inescapable that concerns about China have come to really dominate this discussion. And the example I like to give people is, what if in November of 2022, it wasn't OpenAI with Microsoft that's their big backer had rolled out ChatGPT? What if it had been a Chinese company? What if it had been Alibaba or Tencent or something from the Chinese Ministry of AI or something? What if they had rolled out this, what appears to be a huge leap in a technology? What would we have said? It certainly, I think, would have been as shocking as Sputnik. It's all we would be talking about, and there'd be all this soul searching. Like, how did Silicon Valley blow it? How did the government blow it? That's scary. And I think there would be a fear element, like we are suddenly at a national security disadvantage. Well, it didn't turn out to be the case. And I don't think anybody I think it's too easy to imagine that happening. And nobody wants that to happen. So I think wanting to make sure that the United States is the undisputed AI leader forever, that we were always the one pushing forward the technological frontier, I think that has injected an extreme note of caution and humility into the entire regulatory debate.
So you're pretty sanguine about the feeling that we're not going to get major AI regulated.
At least on odd days. On even days, I'm a little bit more worried.
Yeah, I'm a little more worried than you are. So I referenced earlier Leopold Aschenbrenner, and I don't know if you've seen his series of blogs. I mean, he points out a couple of things. First, that the Sputnik moment might still happen. And his take is that he shows the electricity production increase in China and how it's gone, exponential. They're just building electrical power capacity by the dozens. And although its chips aren't as advanced, and we've done some efforts to try to stop advanced chips going to them, they could really use power and lower scale chips to just brute force their way, potentially ahead of us. And so he's kind of feeling that, the Sputnik moment might still be out there.
I would not want to rest on our laurels. I think it's important to assume that they're not years behind us, but that they're months behind us. And they're running very, very fast. And I think the energy part, I just wrote about this today, the concerns about being able to have enough energy, they're absolutely real. So I think we should assume the worst. We should assume that we somehow came out first, and we need whatever we view our strengths are, we should double down on those strengths. And our obvious weaknesses, that should be priority number one for our federal government. I would assume that those scary stories are true. And I hope that message is getting through. Though I wonder that it is. I don't know that it is because we just had it. Because we had this Chips and Science Act. People don't know much about the Science Act. The Science Act was about spending a lot more on R&D, and we can barely fund the levels that were in that bill, which I think were actually low. So I wonder. My concern would be we're so worried about other things. And I mean, I think the number one priority of the next Congress would say, if the betting marks of the polls are right, if it's Donald Trump, the first priority is going to be extending like his tax cuts, which is fine. I love, I love tax cuts. But fundamentally, what we need to think about is through that lens of making sure that we are the technological leader going forward. If you think that's a priority, like the number one or two priority, then what do you do next? I think one thing you do next is make sure we can build stuff in this country as fast as possible.
Well, I do think no matter who wins, the next big chips type bill is going to be AI focused. I mean, clearly chips lead to that to some extent, but I think we're going to see that's definitely going to be on the menu. But the other thing that Leopold Aschenbrenner brings up that I think is disturbing and very, very accurate, I think, is, his take is whoever gets to this super intelligence first has a huge advantage, even if that's just months. Because then you can deploy a lot of these agents to go do things to accelerate the pace, and it just takes off, right? And so his take is that almost all of it will be stolen by the Chinese or the North Koreans. Basically, the models will be stolen, no question, at some point. First of all, he basically says every single one of our companies and labs around the world are in the West and in the United States have been thoroughly penetrated by the Chinese and probably by the North Koreans and Russians. So he goes into a very big national security piece where he thinks that AI research is going to need to be taken into the SCIF and taken behind the national security wall, air gapped, that kind of stuff. And the national security state is basically going to come in and say, this is so important. Like, we can't stop the Chinese from stealing it, but we can delay them a few months. And if those few months get us ahead, that's worth it. So basically, his take is the national security state needs to come in, and we need to take like a whole of society approach and turn it into kind of a Manhattan project.
Yeah, that strikes me as somewhat science fictional, that the second you sort of get to that, that sort of human level AI, that you sort of go into warp speed, all of a sudden you can do lots of things. But again, I think the history of technology should be the baseline, and the baseline is just because you know how to do something doesn't mean it's immediately transformative. I think about the Japanese companies that still use fax machines. I mean, there is a lot of status quo and stasis in a society where you have built your entire society around a certain sort of technological paradigm. And even if like there is another paradigm which you can adopt, you just cannot adopt it absolutely right away. I just don't think that you would have the resources, the trained people, the sort of the political process, particularly in China, to do that. So I'm not sure it matters if you get a month ahead. As far as taking behind the national security wall, I don't know. I really have not thought about that. I can imagine a lot of scenarios. I suppose probably not a perfect example, but you were talking about so that the Chinese can immediately steal our models. Again, I think there's more than having like the model. I think about how the Soviets stole the designs for the Concorde, and then they rolled out their own version of the Concorde. Kind of a little funky, because the Soviet Union looked a little clunkier. And they tried that thing out at the Paris Air Show, and 3 minutes later, it was in a fireball on the ground. I mean, just sort of happen, just being able to steal the stuff doesn't mean you can actually implement it and that you can actually implement this successfully across your society. So I don't know if it matters if you get there first. I'd rather be first, but I was thinking of making this whole national security issue one of my next things I write about, and our conversation has given me added enthusiasm about that.
So having that pseudo work with the national security state, not totally, but I think taking it behind the wall would basically kill innovation. But I do think that the cultural mismatch between the research community and Silicon Valley, like I was just talking, my nephew is he's studying ML models for materials at University of Manchester, right? So he's going to go get a PhD. He's going to be some AI guy. Telling him that like, oh, the Ministry of Defense is going to come and like tell you can't do this and you got to put it here and you got to like air gap. I mean, that's crazy to them, right? They just don't, that doesn't compute. That hasn't been the case for 70 years, right? So I think that it's something we're going to have to deal with. No question. They're coming. I think they have some valid interests, national security state. And I totally reject like the Google employees are like, I'm not going to work on this project because it might kill people. Like that's got to go. You are part of like the West and the United States, and like helping our military is better than, blah, blah, blah.
I think there's a recognition in Silicon Valley that is not a sustainable stance for American companies.
And so I think they need to come together a little bit, and but allowing the national security state to take over feels like, and direct it, that feels like, hey, we lose the advantage at that point. So basically, I think we've got to just put all guns blazing to get as much as we can from the technology. And the reality is these other states always steal it from us. That's just the way it works, but we have to stay ahead. Don't kill the golden goose, like to protect it, right? So that's sort of how I look at it. But I do think I would love to hear your thoughts on it and talk to some people, because I think this is an underappreciated aspect of this. Like, because it's general purpose, you're now seeing this world where like, first it was like, hey, technologies were consumer or business or military. Now, over the internet kind of became blended things. And now I feel like AI is like, it's like everything. So of course, the more powerful model you make to serve up videos to kids is also super powerful for the military, right? So they are going to get involved. And the question is, who and how are we going to do it? And are we going to kill the golden goose in doing so?
I think that's a really good point. There's one thing I think we figured out that we know how to do in this country, because people said to me, but aren't you worried about the failure to regulate and all? I'm like, there's one thing we know how to do, which is to quash a technology. We know how to do that. If we really look around, where's the nuclear reactor? And by this point, a fusion reactor at every corner. We took a technology that people thought was going to build the future. And within the course of a decade, we stopped building it. So we know how to limit and constrain a technology if it loses what they call social license. So my concern is that we'll be far too blasé about the impact of regulation or somehow nationalizing it. So we have to like transport all the Silicon Valley guys to some base in the middle of Utah, Area 51 or something, where every morning they have to get on an airplane and fly to Area 51 before they start. The more as I'm saying it, I'm like, that actually sounds like something that can happen. How did we get here to begin with? We got here to begin with because we're able to attract really smart people, and we're able to allow them to work in an atmosphere of creativity and freedom, with the possibility that they might get super rich if they solve the right problem. So I think, so that is the formula. And so before we say like that we need to change that formula, we better be awfully sure. It's too easy to say like time is of the essence. And the only other example we have is the Manhattan Project. I would look for differences between this and the Manhattan Project before what I assume there's nothing but similarities.
I totally agree. And I hope we don't do this. The one piece of regulation that I hadn't thought of actually came up on your podcast with, I can't remember his name right now, Thier or somebody from R Street. So he mentioned sort of the 96 Telecom Act that created federal protections for the internet and e-commerce. that enabled the Amazons and everyone to get out there by protecting them from 50 plus different kinds of regulations that would have our political entrepreneurs across the country would have posed, which you are currently seeing right now in California play out. I thought that was actually a pretty interesting idea.
It is good because it's a really good example of that debate and the debate about something called Section 230, which, protects all kinds of online platforms for not being held liable to what people say and do on them. That became a very big debate about social media. So now that the debate has that seems like a somewhat less interesting debate at the moment. And now the debate's about AI, they just sort of went back and took all those issues and they're moving them. So, hey, if you're like the Section 230, the anti-230 activists 5 years ago, now you're still the 230 activists. Now you're going to try to, win the battle with AI. And as Adam said, I would think very hard about the success of the internet revolution in the 90s, taking a very hands-off approach to a technology that seemed to be changing very quickly and that I think has worked out pretty well, and without which we would not be having this discussion. Because had we heavily regulated in the 90s, not only do I think we would not have the social media platforms, which, maybe some people think is fine, but we would not have the AI revolution and all, I think, the good things that it's going to be bringing us over the next few years, few decades, and probably longer.
But the Minitel would still be awesome. That would be like the best technology we have. So if anyone doesn't know that, it's a French top-down regulatory thing of the internet. But anyway, that died. So it actually didn't die till like 2007. That's kind of crazy.
Things stick around. Again, there's some great books about how technology just tends to stick around, whether it's ATMs or fax machines. Just because we can technologically replace them doesn't mean that they go away the next day.
So I just wanted to wrap that point. So what I think that he was saying, and I think is a really good idea, is like, let's create some legislation that says, hey, we need to see how this technology is changing. I mean, it's just changing every day, right? So like, we can't regulate it now. We're going to protect it from various state regulations and give it like breathing space to develop. That's what we need.
I think that's important. I think Eddie had mentioned the California bill. I think that is a pattern to ruin this thing. Is all of a sudden we have people with perhaps not great knowledge of the technology rushing to do something because they didn't rush to do something with social media. You got all these policy entrepreneurs in state houses across the country who think like that's the right thing to do. Yeah, I think that needs to be put to a stop because I think that will absolutely put a lot of sand into the gears.
Okay. So we kind of touched on a little bit of the regulatory environment. And again, I do think that you're hitting that things are probably better now than they were a year ago. And Europe, of course, Europe's gone crazy. I think they've ensured that they will have no part in this technology going forward. But it sounds like, if we can get some more time to allow the technology to develop, that's going to be the real key. So then moving past the regulatory side, we focus on government in this podcast. So not only does it regulate, it also does other stuff too. So have you given any thought to what AI can actually do to help the government serve the public better? Like, has that been something you've thought through yet?
I mean, a little bit. As far as like the functioning of government programs or the functioning of, say, Medicare, I know there's already lots of experiments going on as far as the delivery of healthcare services. That's a big part of the economy. If you want to blame weak productivity on anything, over the past half century, you could say that it's been in sort of services, sort of harder to automate, particularly in, healthcare, government broadly, and education. Like those are areas of government where one can see where AI can make people vastly more productive. It's always a problem, like getting you have to draw because it can be there can be kind of a salary differential, and you draw different kinds of people into government. Is you want to try to get the best talent, and if you and I'm pretty sure like country like Singapore, which you always hear about, they have great government. They're very highly paid. They get great people going into government. But I think one of the advantages of AI, what we've already seen from early experiments, is that it's really good at taking people who are sort of your bottom quarter of workers and making them average workers, which may not be, curing cancer, but if you can do that throughout government, which is is improve the productivity of your least productive people, whether it's in an agency, whether it's in a hospital, or whether it's in the classroom. Like that could be absolutely amazing. Take the bottom 25% of America's teachers and turn them into average teachers because they have these new tools which can, accurately diagnose like what a kid doesn't know, how to best present him the information. That alone would be an absolutely phenomenal. I think that's possible. So if we're worried about productivity and productivity in government services of all kinds, I mean, that's certainly one area where it seems like AI might have a big impact.
I think the problem you're going to see that there's probably two issues. One is job protection type issues where people don't want to let it in because they're worried about the impact on the bureaucracy. And I think the second issue is really like the fear-based culture. So right now, plenty of agencies are experimenting and they're doing good stuff, and that's great. But definitely it's more on, if you broadly applied it, you are more likely to get in trouble, and that would have more impact on your program than any win you get. And that's sort of the issue with deploying this technology. So I think it's going to take some amount of mandate, budget threat kind of thing from Congress and from the administration to really get these technologies adopted.
My baseline expectation is that it will go slower than I would like. And I think that's a great point. I say that my first experience working for government was working for my local town. I worked in the water and sewer department as a summer job throughout college. And if there's one thing I learned, that there wasn't a lot of incentive to take risks. There wasn't a lot of incentives to do anything different, not at all. My hope, though, is that the effectiveness and the productivity impacts of this technology will ultimately be, if it's as significant as what we've been saying, that there's just too much upside and to avoid it. Again, it may be a few years later than what we would like, but they'll get there.
Yeah, I mean, I also think there's going to be this forcing function where AI enables the people that government interacts with, say I put out a regulation and I'm getting comments or lawsuits or, various places like that, or even drug applications, where if AI supercharges those sectors, the only response government can do without being completely overwhelmed is to deploy AI to deal with the AI. If you can start mass manufacturing drug trials, right, and you can submit 1 million drugs in a year, whatever, I don't know, the FDA is going to have to do something to deal with that. And same with regulation.gov. If you're getting that many comments, the only way you're going to be able to deal with it is through using AI. And so I think there's a sort of a forcing function.
Even though, I guess technically the pandemic is over, and I think we're still trying to figure out all the lessons. I think one lesson that struck people is government probably moves a lot slower and is a lot more inefficient than what they imagined. And if there's a technology out there that can change that, I think there will be a push from Congress. I would hope at both sides of the aisle. I mean, you can understand Republicans pushing it because they always say, look how inefficient is government, get more efficient. But if you're on the other side of the aisle and you think government needs to be efficient, if you're a progressive and you want government to do more, well, then it's sort of in your interest to make sure that whatever it does it really, really well, because then that builds confidence that it can do other things. So I certainly could imagine a scenario where where Congress ends up being that action forcing mechanism, I think that you just mentioned.
You're always more optimistic than I am. But there is some amount, where different parts of say, the right doesn't necessarily want the government to be really efficient at regulating water projects, right? They actually want to stop that. So I think we're going to see a lot of...
They don't want a more efficient IRS.
That's right. They want the IRS to be a lot worse at its job, right? So I do think we're going to see these battles. We've seen them. I mean, we've already seen them over, modernization of the IRS, right? I mean, the Biden administration put $80 billion or whatever, and the Republicans are hacking away at that every year. So I think we're going to see something similar, play out. It's just another technology. So on AI, James, if you were going to say your hope for what you would love to see in the next year and then maybe the next 5 years, what are you looking at and man, this is what I'm really hoping AI gets to or can do?
I'm hoping that the productivity advantages to business are so obvious and the advantages to science research are so clear over the next few years that we stop having the debate about, is this an important technology? That if we have this, and then we have to figure out what are the policies to keep it going, make it go faster, and make sure it gets deployed throughout the economy with as little resistance as possible. And I really think that's a 2020s phenomenon. So that's what I'm hoping for. And then all of a sudden, Listen, if the result of all this is instead of this economy growing at 2% for the next 10 years, if it grows at 2.4%, that doesn't seem like much. Pretty big difference. That's a 25% increase and way beyond what Wall Street and the Fed are expecting. And I think we're also looking at a country where where wage gains become more obvious and people become more enthusiastic about their lives. And I think we can do better than that.
Faster, please, right?
Always.
Well, we'll leave it with that, James. That was awesome. I appreciate you being on the pod, and we'll look forward to that national security article. Be waiting to hear about it. So
After chatting with you, now I'm really fired up.
all right, great. I did one good thing today. That's good.
Great conversation. Hope to talk to you again.
All right, see you, James. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.